Morning, everybody. Thank you for having me, and apologies for not standing over at the podium. As Chris said, I'm Helen Griffiths, and I'm the Chief Executive of a green space charity called Fields in Trust. And championing access to parks and green spaces. Championing access to parks and green spaces is very much at the core of what we do. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of our work with you today. I think that... Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, great. I'll start again. I'm Helen. I'm the Chief Executive of a green space charity called Fields in Trust, and championing equitable access to parks and green spaces for everybody is at the very core of what we do. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of our work with you and talking a bit about the data and insight that we have developed to be able to really kind of dig into the process. So, first, it's probably worth me telling you a little bit about who we are, because not everybody is probably familiar with us. But we are a UK-wide charity, and we were founded almost 100 years ago. And our primary objective has been to champion and protect equitable access to green spaces, to parks, to playing fields, to playgrounds, to all kinds of green spaces for everybody in a community. And since 1925, we've legally protected or future-proofed over 13,000 hectares of green space in partnership with local authorities, many of which are in the room today. So thank you very much for your continued support and partnership. And that focus is really ensuring that our children and grandchildren will have access to those spaces. But we really focus on proximity and access in relation to today's theme, because we're very interested in ensuring that those green spaces can generate maximum health and well-being benefits and a connection to nature. And we've worked closely with Natural England on the Green Infrastructure Standards framework that has already been referenced today. And what our current data is telling us is that 21% of all households in the UK live within a 10-minute walk of a Fields in Trust protected park. So that's over 14 million people in the country who have a park within 10-minute walk that has been permanently protected, that we know will be there for future generations. And our aim is to be able to widen this impact by engaging strategically with local authorities, using some of the data that we're going to talk about today, to be able to protect green space in neighbourhoods where it can have the most impact. And why do our parks need protecting? Well, our world is changing, as we know. Over the past 100 years, the environment has gone under significant transformation, and population continues to increase from 45 million when we were founded in the 1920s to almost 68 million today. So that pressure on land and housing and infrastructure is increasing, and we need to meet the needs of an expanding and ageing population. And because of that expansion and urbanisation, we recognise, as we've been talking about, that our connections with nature are really reducing as a result. We know that over 214 spaces designated as public parks or gardens have been lost in the last 3 years, as well as thousands of hectares of land that's been changed to residential use. And you can see some examples on screen of what that means and how those spaces have really been impacted. Second. And so what I want to move on to now is some of the work that we've developed to be able to look at how much access do local neighbourhoods have to green space. So how green is my neighbourhood? What is the level of access to green spaces? Where is that access sufficient? Where do we have gaps, and where do we need to improve that provision? So hopefully some of you will be familiar with the creation of the Ordnance Survey Green Space Master Map back in 2018. And prior to that point, there really was no single source of truth to understand what the UK-wide picture looked like in terms of how much green space there was, how much green space was being lost, what were the trends, what did that look like. And as a charity, we weren't able to answer the question that we were asked most frequently, which is how many parks were lost in the last 10, 15, 20 years. We didn't know the answer. So 2018 was a complete game changer for us to be able to look at the detail and think about how access to green space really varies from place to place, and how over the long term that could enable us to look at those trends and talk about what that loss might look like. So in 2019, we published the first Green Space Index, so the first tool to create a measure of parks and green space access and provision. It's based on five indicators to look at how much green space is there per person in the area and what does access look like using a 10-minute walk, unfortunately not 15, but we use a 10-minute walk as a proxy of good access. And since then we've been evolving the Green Space Index by adding new features and analysis over time. So in 2019 we launched. In 2020, we added the population projection piece to be able to look at what the impact of increased population would have over a period of time. In 2021, we looked at the inequality of access of green space and how stark that was in particular neighbourhoods. And in 2022, we put an additional focus on how the green space analysis could really support what we were learning in terms of distribution of parks and green spaces with the flagship Levelling Up agenda. And in 2023, we've added a new timely walkability measure. So prior to 2023, we were looking at a 10-minute walk as a buffer zone. But in 2023, we've now been able to add a walkability point to the Green Space Index so that we've got a really realistic understanding of how accessible our local green spaces are. So what do we know? Well, the headline figures obviously tell us what we're looking at a national level, and we know that 6.1 million people currently live further than a 10-minute walk from a park or green space, and that the average amount of green space per person is 30 metres squared. And we've calculated using the Green Space Index that only 6% of publicly accessible green space is currently protected by Fields and Trust. But of course other designations will exist across all of the portfolios that you're involved with and managing. And that's great to have that national picture, and we can see what that looks like, and we can use that in our conversations to try and champion better access for everybody to parks and green spaces. But obviously what we're really interested in is how does that drill down to local level. And so we want to look at a couple of local examples today. Thank you to Derby and Walsall for agreeing to let us put the spotlight on green space provision in those particular areas. Oh, apologies. So what we can see here is that we've got both Derby and Walsall scoring below the Green Space Index score of 1, meaning that in both areas there is insufficient green space provision to meet the needs of that particular population. And that picture will of course vary. So what you can see on screen is in the darker areas, the darker yellow, we can see that that area is meeting the benchmark standard, whereas in the light area then we've got a lower than minimum standard provision. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about what that provision looks like that we recognise the nuance across the piece, and that not everywhere, when we're looking at this, we really need to look at individual levels. And drilling down a little bit further, we can see that these maps show that there's a wide range of provision per person within the area. So both Walsall and Derby are close to the national average that we've already talked about, but the graded maps show just how differently that plays out depending on where you live. So there's very significant swathes of both areas that fall below 20 square metres per person as a consequence of both provision and population density. And if I just flick through to the next slide, on both screens, which is proving quite complex, then you can see that both Walsall and Derby outperform the national averages, with only 6% and 3% of the population respectively being further than a 10-minute walking distance from a park or green space. And as mentioned before, that's based on actual walking distance where we've looked at that accessibility point. So now I just wanted to highlight the number of green spaces in both of those areas. So what you can see from the maps here is the total number of parks and green spaces scattered across both of those different areas. And if we then move through, we can see the number of those spaces that have been permanently protected by Fields and Trust. So 21% of green space in Walsall has been protected in partnership with Fields and Trust, and 5% of the currently available green spaces in Derby have been permanently protected by Fields and Trust. which enables us to then look at the percentage of population that is within a 10-minute walking distance of a protected park. So back to the really important indices that Natural England are looking at and how we're looking at the 15-minute accessibility point, we can really start to see where there is access to nature in an urban setting that has been protected in perpetuity. So 25% of the population within Walsall and 7% of the population within Derby are currently meeting that standard. And why is that important? Well, I think what we want to focus on today is really understanding where access to parks and green spaces is missing, where we think there is a greater need for better access, where communities are not currently benefiting from all of the many things that we know that parks and green spaces can bring. I'm flicking quickly because I know that Chris is telling me that we're close to time. One of the things that we're very conscious of is that with future population projections, we know that that position is only set to get worse. So if we are not creating more parks and green spaces, and we estimate that we need at least 4,000 new parks and green spaces across the whole of the UK in the next 10 years, just to be able to kind of meet the current levels of provision, we can see from the impact of population growth just how much that's going to have an impact nationally. And from this graph, you can see how that varies from place to place in the local area. And what do we want the future of those parks and green spaces to look like? So I think we can see from this particular screen, what we're trying to do as an organisation is to think about how do we make those spaces more inclusive? What do we need them to do? We need them to be accessible, safe and inclusive, as we're talking about today, but we also need spaces to do something slightly different than they used to. So that multifunctionality of green space now is incredibly important. We need them to support our healthy and active lifestyles. We need them to be able to support our mental well-being, to be resilient and to be able to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change, to be able to provide spaces for nature to thrive, and to be able to adapt to the changing needs of those communities. And what we'd like to do in support of everybody in this room in terms of how we'd like to partner from Fields and Trust out to different local authorities is really help to secure a better future for those parks and green spaces with more inclusive access. And so as an example here, we've demonstrated how we could improve the situation of the number of people in Walsall that would be within a 10-minute walk of a permanently protected space. So we know what the current position is. If we were to add if we were to protect a further 10 parks, then we could double the amount of people in Walsall based on these buffer zones who have access to a park or green space that is permanently protected. One of the things that we can do as an organisation is look at a range of variables and think about where are the parks that are most strategically significant. And that changes significantly if you look at the high strategic need and the areas of the most deprivation. We'd be looking at a completely different set of parks that we want to protect in the local area to be able to guarantee that the people who need access to parks and green spaces in the long term can have it based on this modelling. And these are really the conversations that we would love to have with you in the workshops this afternoon, ably assisted by Gabor, our GIS analyst, who actually will be doing some interactive sessions using this data to dig into your local areas and understand where the green space provision could be improved, where it could be protected, and how we could work in partnership with you to achieve that. Done.